The Skyline Grand Hotel gleamed like a jewel in the heart of downtown Seattle, an architectural trophy of glass, gold, and ambition that never slept. From the 27th floor, the city below looked like a vein of lights pulsing through the dark. Tonight, in a ballroom bathed in golden crystal chandeliers and velvet hushes, Damian Walsh, founder of the Mercurian Media Group, was hosting a charity gala in honor of the 6th anniversary of the foundation he named after his mother. And I, Celeste Monroe, his wife of 6 years, stood quietly near the entrance, dressed to disappear. The room glowed with elegance. White orchids climbed tall glass vases, soft jazz wrapped itself around the clink of champagne flutes, and the sea of tailored suits and satin gowns moved like a choreographed current. I smoothed the folds of my deep sapphire dress, an old favorite that Damien once dismissed as too serious, too schoolmarm for someone in corporate communications. I wore it tonight, not for him, but for the symbolism. The color of restraint. The color of thunderclouds before a storm. In my silver clutch was a single envelope, flat, sharp-edged, and cold. Inside, 6 years' worth of quiet observation. A USB stick, small enough to be missed, but heavy with truths Damien thought I'd never find. Everything I carried tonight had a purpose. I wasn't attending this gala. I was closing it. Damien thrived on evenings like these. He moved through the room with the assurance of a man who'd never had to second-guess his charm. His laugh floated above conversations like a ribbon of confidence. To his right were the partners who helped him turn Mercurian from a boutique PR firm into a media empire. To his left sat the investors who wore their wealth like war medals. My family had been placed at a corner table near the catering doors, an afterthought in Damien's carefully orchestrated social hierarchy. My mother looked up as I walked past, her face tightening in quiet confusion. She didn't know this was the night her daughter stopped playing along. She didn't know I was about to rewrite the story she'd always warned me not to provoke. Damien lifted his wineglass, a deep Merlot that glistened like oxidized blood. His voice, as always, was smooth, practiced, and precise. 6 years ago, he began, I was told to marry someone simple, someone who wouldn't interfere, someone who'd support me from the background. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the tables. So, I married Celeste, he continued, turning slightly toward me, not bothering to make eye contact. A communications advisor who preferred the quiet corner of a library over the chaos of boardrooms. She was perfect, harmless, elegant, silent. Another wave of chuckles, polite and unsure. But simplicity, Damien said, his tone sharpening ever so slightly, comes at a cost. 6 years of investment in a partner who yields no return. Makes you wonder about the ROI, doesn't it? The room quieted. I stood up slowly. My smile didn't falter. It deepened. Thank you, Damien, I said, my voice clear. That was a memorable speech. I stepped toward the central table, my heels echoing softly against the marble floor. I set the envelope on the table beside his wineglass and opened it with deliberate calm. And since we're discussing investments and returns, I continued, perhaps our guests should be made aware of some numbers that weren't on the PowerPoint. I unfolded 2 sheets of paper, one pristine, one smudged with edits. Damien stared at them like they were ghosts of a crime he barely remembered committing. This, I said, is the original prenuptial agreement I signed 6 years ago. And this is your edited version. You thought I wouldn't notice, but you forgot I spent 5 years handling internal communications for a legal advisory firm. I know how digital fingerprints work. A hush fell over the crowd. People leaned in. Damien reached forward instinctively, but I slid the papers just out of reach and placed the USB beside them. You also assumed I'd never find out about Samantha, I said. Your sister's college friend, the one who hugs me a little too long at family dinners. A few raised eyebrows. Damien's eyes widened, flickering across the crowd now watching him closely. I held up my phone, tapped once. Seconds later, the room came alive with sound. Pings, dings, buzzes. Guests pulled out their devices. The screen glow illuminated their faces as they read. She still thinks I'm at the office. Can't wait to see you tonight. Your wife is so clueless. She actually talked about classic novels while we were hooking up downstairs. The truth didn't need dramatics. It just needed precision. Damien's jaw tightened. His hand trembled around the wineglass. He gripped it hard. A second later, it shattered in his hand. A gasp escaped someone's throat. A waiter rushed forward with a napkin. I didn't flinch. "Instead of applauding your great investment tonight," I said quietly, "maybe we should raise a toast to your remarkable financial career." I turned to face the room. As of tonight, Damian Walsh is no longer the majority shareholder of Mercurian Media Group. Whispers erupted like wildfire. My fingers closed around the clutch. I smiled one last time, softly, coolly, then walked out, the train of my sapphire dress whispering against the marble behind me like a quiet drum roll for a new beginning. Damian's voice didn't follow. His era of domination had ended, and no one even realized I had been writing the script all along. Perhaps you thought I couldn't tell the difference between a legal clause and a paragraph from a novel. Funny, isn't it? You've always underestimated a literature teacher's reading comprehension. The room gradually fell silent. Forks stopped mid-air. Champagne bubbles stilled in crystal flutes. Damian's fingers hovered near the folder but didn't make contact. He was calculating, trying to determine how much I knew, how much I could prove. That was when I reached into my clutch and pulled out a USB drive. Simple. Metallic. But in this moment, heavier than the weight of 6 years of lies. This contains audio files, internal meetings, off-the-record discussions, conversations about shell companies, tax loopholes, and charitable donations that never reached any charity. I paused. I might have been a literature professor, but I've learned how to annotate more than poems. Fortunately, I also have a dear friend, attorney Elena Carter, who helped translate it all into something a judge would appreciate. Almost on cue, the wide banquet doors swung open. Elena walked in with the poise of someone who didn't need to announce herself. Her navy suit was crisp, her stride even. She carried a document case, black leather, thick. The murmurs died instantly. Even Damian went rigid. "Good evening, Damian. I believe we last crossed paths at the Seattle Regulatory Summit," she said, each syllable like a chisel. "I'm here tonight not for dinner," she continued, placing the case on the table, "but to formally deliver legal documents on behalf of my client, Celeste Monroe." The folder snapped open. She spread out forms, official court documents, lined with stamps and signatures. "This petition moves to nullify the prenup on grounds of fraud. We've included forensic analyses of the document's metadata, proving your edits. Also included are exhibits of falsified records, off-the-book investments, and correspondence implicating misuse of charitable funds." Damian turned pale. The room, thick with power only minutes ago, now felt like a vacuum. His closest allies looked down at their plates. A few quietly pulled out their phones, pretending to check emails but clearly disengaging. "And while we're unveiling things," I said gently, "everyone here might want to check their inboxes." Dings and chimes erupted in unison. Phones lit up, screens filled with screenshots, text messages, photos. Samantha Lee's name appeared over and over again. Her messages weren't subtle. Neither were the photos, hotel rooms, receipts, time-stamped proof. "She thought I was at a board meeting," one read. "She still thinks I'm staying late for quarterly prep." Damian's hand clenched the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "I can explain," he said, his voice tight. "It's not what it looks like." Elena raised a hand. "Mr. Walsh, I would advise you to remain silent. Anything you say from this point forward may be entered into court proceedings." He turned toward his circle. "You all know this is politics. These are restructuring strategies. You've seen these playbooks before." No one nodded. No one moved. Richard Hale, his longtime associate, slowly stood. "I can't be involved in this," he said softly, eyes never lifting from the floor. He collected his coat and walked away. That was when the doors opened again. 3 men in gray suits entered, polished, stern. One stepped forward, flashing a badge. "Mr. Damian Walsh, we're with the Federal Financial Crimes Division. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges including financial fraud, tax evasion, and falsification of federally regulated documents." Gasps swept the room. Damian staggered back. "This is outrageous. I've cooperated with audits. I've paid my dues." He scanned for support, found none. I stepped forward slowly, pulling one last item from my handbag. A document titled Form 2111, IRS Whistleblower Submission. "This," I said, "is the report I filed 3 months ago, alongside supporting exhibits authenticated by my legal and forensic team." His eyes narrowed. You did this?" I met his stare. "I protected myself." His voice dropped to a bitter whisper. "You want money? Power? What? I shook my head. I want you to understand that power isn't taken, it's surrendered, one underestimation at a time, and you handed yours over the day you thought I was just the quiet wife. The agents stepped forward. One of them read him his rights. Damien didn't fight. His arms lowered, his head dropped. The illusion had shattered. As they led him out, the ballroom remained hushed. Elena closed the case calmly. "You did well," she whispered. I didn't reply. I looked around at the guests who once dismissed me as a decoration in Damien's orbit. Not one of them could meet my eyes, and for the first time, I didn't need them to. 3 months later, spring unfolded in soft pastels across Westbrook University's campus. Tulips bloomed beside concrete paths. Students lounged in patches of sun. Inside my lecture hall, a group of students debated Gatsby's love for Daisy. Was it love, I asked, or just an infatuation with the ideal? Hands went up. I listened. I smiled. The plaque on my desk now read Celeste Monroe Carter. No longer a shadow of a man's success. No longer a whisper behind power. Just a woman with her own last name, her own voice, her own history. Finally written. My manuscript, Hidden Truths, A Woman's Guide to Financial Self-Defense, had gone to print. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't flashy. But it sold, because women knew the voice inside was their own. And on Thursday evenings in a community room just off Waterstone Street, I hosted something that mattered even more, a study group. 12 women. Varied in age, in background, in trauma. Some were healing. Some were still escaping. Some simply wanted to understand their paychecks. But all were brave enough to show up. We begin, I'd say, with one truth. Your money should never be a mystery. Each week we tackled a topic: retirement clauses, joint accounts, coercion hidden in budget control. Every story shared, every question asked, turned confusion into confidence. Then one afternoon, the door creaked open. Samantha Lee. Thinner, paler, wearing a coat too large for her frame. "I saw the flyer," she said quietly. "I don't know if I'm in the right place yet, but I'd like to try." The room stilled. They didn't know who she was, but I did. And still I didn't blink. No one comes here ready. They come here willing. She nodded and sat at the back. I continued the session. The past didn't vanish, but it no longer controlled the room. Week after week, she returned. She took notes, she listened, she changed. And I forgave, not because she asked, not because she deserved it, but because I refused to let her define me any longer. By summer, our group had grown. We held workshops, mock negotiations, contract reading circles. Women helped each other build resumes, challenge settlements, create safety plans. We didn't need slogans or speeches. We just needed each other. And I, once the quiet one in the room, now stood with shoulders unbowed. When the final session of the season ended, I erased the board slowly. The room emptied. Outside, the trees swayed. I looked at the last line on the board. Power begins with awareness. And for the first time, I understood that this quiet ripple, was the revolution I was always meant to lead. It began with a folding table and a borrowed projector. The community center on Waterstone Street wasn't glamorous. Flickering fluorescent lights, a perpetually cold floor, and the smell of old carpet cleaner in the hallway, but it was quiet, private, safe, and most importantly, it was mine. Thursday evenings became sacred. Each week, I prepared binders full of printouts, sample contracts, budget templates, legal glossaries. There were no podiums, no credentials required to speak. Only a circle of folding chairs, a chalkboard with handwritten quotes, and a pot of ginger tea steeping near the radiator. That was how it started. Just 12 women, notebooks in hand, unsure if they belonged. We begin with one truth, I'd say. Your money should never be a mystery. I spoke slowly, watching their eyes shift from hesitant to curious. We walked through the most basic terms: joint accounts, beneficiary clauses, what it meant when a document had irrevocable in the corner. I watched the faces around me transform. Women who had signed things they never read. Women who had let their partners take care of everything until everything disappeared. Each one carried a story. Nora, a retired nurse, had co-signed her husband's business loans for years. When he passed, she learned she owed $500,000 in debt. Rachel, a single mother, had unknowingly given up claim to the house during her divorce by signing a form slipped in between daycare receipts. And Lily, young, quiet, still in college, thought asking about her wages would make her sound ungrateful. Each of them had once been told that someone else will handle it. Now, they handled it themselves. One Thursday, as I passed out case study packets on asset distribution, the door opened. Samantha Lee walked in. I recognized her instantly. Thinner, her posture folded slightly inward. She clutched a reusable shopping bag as though it contained something fragile. The coat she wore was wool, stylish, but overwhelmed her frame now. I saw the flyer for this group, she said softly. I don't know if I belong here. I didn't speak immediately. Around the room, heads turned toward me, waiting for some signal. I looked at her, not with resentment but with recognition. She stood where I had once stood, lost, unmoored, and quietly begging not to be turned away. You're here, I finally said. That's what matters. She sat at the back. I resumed class. I didn't erase our history, but I didn't let it dictate the space either. Over time, Samantha showed up every week. She never missed a session. She took notes with the precision of a woman retracing the lines of her own collapse. I watched her change, just as I had. One night, as the rain battered the windows and the city outside disappeared behind foggy glass, I drew a simple diagram on the chalkboard. 3 circles. One for what you earn, one for what you need, one for what you give away. Some of us have been taught that giving is what defines us, I said, chalk still in hand. But if you keep emptying your cup, you'll eventually have nothing left to drink. The room was silent. That week, Lily stayed after class. She was always the last to leave. Her voice trembled when she spoke. I used to think that not understanding money meant I wasn't trying hard enough. But you make it feel like I can learn. That I'm not broken. You're not, I told her. You've just been told a lie for too long. The truth is waiting for you. We grew. The folding chairs became a circle of strength. We created mock negotiation sessions, practiced reading credit reports, rewrote job offer letters together. Rachel negotiated her first raise. Nora refinanced her mortgage. Lily built a savings plan and cried the day she hit her first $1,000. I no longer felt like I was lecturing. I was witnessing, facilitating a process I had once crawled through myself. The media still followed Damien's case. He was facing formal charges, federal, state, and civil suits. I didn't read the articles anymore. I had stopped needing justice from headlines. The justice I wanted was unfolding in this very room. Samantha spoke for the first time in week 12. We were discussing financial abuse, how control over resources could often be more damaging than bruises. My ex didn't hit me, she said, but he made me feel like I had to ask permission to exist. She didn't say Damien's name. She didn't need to. The room held its breath, and then one by one, the women nodded. They had been there too, in different ways, with different faces. That night, Samantha walked up to me after class. I never said sorry, she began. You don't need to, I interrupted gently. This room isn't about confession, it's about truth. She nodded, swallowing hard. I was wrong. I let myself be used. I hurt you, even if I didn't mean to. I met her eyes. You're here. You stayed. That's more than most people ever do. And I meant it. By late spring, our group had become something bigger than I imagined. We began rotating facilitators. We partnered with local legal clinics. One of the women created a website to share resources. Another started a podcast. Every Thursday night, the lights stayed on longer. We laughed more. We argued. We supported. We became a collective of women writing their own narratives. I stood before them, not as someone with all the answers, but as someone who had asked every single question. And when the semester ended at Westbrook University, I handed out final essays and smiled as my students trickled out into the sunlit quad. My life had finally reached balance. One foot in the classroom, one in the world that had nearly crushed me, and both planted firmly in truth. Damien sent a letter once. It arrived in a plain envelope, unsigned. Just 2 sentences. I never thought you were capable of this. You proved me wrong. I didn't reply. He didn't deserve to know that being underestimated had been my greatest weapon all along. One Friday, the community room was too full. Chairs spilled into the hallway. I stood near the coffee urn and looked out over the crowd. Women I once saw curled into themselves now leaned in toward one another. Laughing, teaching, leading. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a revolution. It was something better. It was permanent. Financial knowledge, I said at the final session of that term, is not about preparing for war. It's about refusing to be conquered quietly. The applause was quiet. No one needed fireworks. We already had freedom. And when I locked the door that night and walked out into the fading light, I knew the story was no longer about what Damien did to me. It was about what I chose to do with what was left. And that, finally, was mine. The key turned in the lock with a soft click. The community center was silent now. The overhead lights dimmed, the chairs stacked in a corner, and the last echo of laughter still hanging faintly in the air. I stood for a long time, fingers resting on the doorknob, reluctant to leave. Outside, the wind carried the scent of early summer. Rain-soaked concrete, fresh grass, and the faint perfume of night-blooming jasmine. It was the kind of night that made you remember everything. The quiet heartbreaks, the whispered triumphs, the faces of women who once thought they were powerless. And in that silence, I allowed myself to feel it. Not grief, not pride, just stillness. It had been 14 months since Damien was arrested, 12 since the official court ruling, 8 since the last time I heard his name mentioned on a news segment. His image had slowly faded from the media cycle, replaced by newer scandals, newer villains. But for me, the echo of his presence lingered in smaller ways. A folder tucked inside a cabinet, a phrase someone used too confidently, a mirror glance where I caught my own posture trying to shrink again. And I had to remind myself, not anymore. Not this time. The group had grown larger than I could have imagined. What began as 12 women around a folding table had expanded into 3 weekly chapters, a rotating calendar of guest speakers, and a waiting list for our 6-week financial literacy and advocacy bootcamp. But more than that, it had become a community. We weren't just sharing knowledge, we were sharing identity, and somewhere between the PDFs and spreadsheets, we had unearthed something none of us had ever been taught to claim. Authority. Personal, legal, emotional, mine. I was now invited to speak at colleges, asked to join panels. I had even been offered a column in a local paper. Money isn't math, navigating the language of control. I accepted, not because I needed a platform, but because I knew the words would find the women who were still waiting in silence, unsure if what they were feeling was real. One of those women emailed me late one night. The subject line read, "How do I know it's abuse if he's never hit me?" Her message was simple. He never touched her, never yelled. He just made her feel stupid for asking about money. Gave her an allowance from her own paycheck. Told her questions made him feel judged. I stayed up past midnight writing her back. You don't need bruises to justify leaving. You only need clarity. And you already have it, or you wouldn't be asking. 2 weeks later, she signed up for our beginner workshop. She wasn't the only one. There was Beatrice, who worked the front desk at a dentist's office for 15 years and had never once asked why her retirement contributions were missing. When she did, she was told it was a clerical error. She brought her contract to class, her hands trembling. It wasn't an error. It was theft hidden in fine print. There was Monica, a mother of 3, who had spent 7 years thinking her husband was just bad with money. He wasn't. He was channeling their savings into a secret account, preparing for a life that didn't include her. And there was June, a woman in her 60s, soft-spoken and warm, who had signed away her house because her son asked her to. "It's just on paper, Mom," he said, "for tax purposes." She only came to class because her neighbor insisted. She stayed because, in her own words, "I'd rather be late to the truth than never arrive." I kept their stories in a small leather notebook, not names, just moments. Because stories are how we survive. And I, who once thought stories belonged only in books, was now watching them rewrite lives. The media eventually moved on from Damien. His face disappeared from the business pages. His name became a footnote in financial fraud seminars and legal textbooks. But I never let myself forget, not out of vengeance, but clarity. What happened to me was not a singular event. It was systemic, polished, polite. And no one talks about polite abuse, about how it's the smile that disarms you, the compliment before the control, the handshake that hides the knife. Polite abuse teaches you to doubt your gut because the damage doesn't look like damage until it does. That's why I teach what I teach. At the end of our advanced course, I give each woman a mirror. It's small, the kind that fits in a purse. On the back is a single word, authority. Look into it, I tell them, until you see someone you trust. They laugh at first, then they do it. And then they don't stop smiling. One Thursday in mid-June, Samantha arrived early. It had been months since she joined. She no longer sat at the back. She volunteered to co-facilitate our entry-level classes and had recently started mentoring Lily. I watched her set up chairs that evening, confident, steady, different. She brought a thermos of tea, a small bouquet of daisies, and a stack of freshly printed worksheets titled Rebuilding After Financial Dependency. "Do you want to lead tonight?" I asked. She blinked, then nodded. "I think I do." She did. And she was brilliant, not because she used legal jargon, but because she didn't. She spoke in plain truths, with no bitterness, just precision. After class, we walked out into the summer air. The sky was soft with clouds and the air smelled like rain that had changed its mind. "Do you ever miss who you were before?" she asked quietly. I thought for a moment. No, but I mourn the years I spent trying to be her. She nodded. "I'm seeing a counselor now," she said. "Not just for what happened with Damien, for how long I believed I deserved it." I didn't respond right away, because that deserved silence, reverence. "And you?" she asked, looking over. "I'm seeing a publisher," I said, smiling. She laughed. "Of course you are." The book wasn't just about Damien. In fact, his name appeared only twice. Hidden Truths, Reclaiming Your Voice Through Financial Self-Defense was part memoir, part guide, part blueprint. It told stories, mine, theirs, ours. It unpacked the mechanics of financial control, but also the emotional scaffolding that holds it up. Shame, silence, love mistaken for sacrifice. When it launched, it didn't make the bestseller list, but it sold out in every shelter, clinic, and community program we donated it to. I didn't need headlines anymore. I had something better. Impact. The final Thursday of summer was our closing circle. The room was packed, standing room only. The walls were covered in posters, quotes from class, contracts annotated with red ink, budget plans, affirmations. Each woman shared one sentence: "I used to believe," followed by, "Now I know." I used to believe asking about money was rude. Now I know staying silent cost me more. Nora, I used to believe debt was my fault. Now I know it was someone else's decision I carried. Samantha, I used to believe I had no right to ask questions. Now I know I should have asked louder. And me? I said this. I used to believe being good meant being quiet. Now I know being whole means being heard. They applauded, not for me, for themselves. And when the lights dimmed and the doors closed behind us, we stood in the parking lot, barefoot and laughing in the humid dark, like survivors of a storm no one saw coming. Because we were. That night, after the circle dispersed, I stayed behind a little longer. I moved slowly through the empty room, collecting stray pens, folding up the last chairs, my fingers brushing across the surfaces like a ritual. It felt almost sacred. This space where lives had quietly turned themselves inside out and begun again. The air hummed with echoes, not of pain, but of awakening. I stood at the chalkboard, where a phrase had been scrawled weeks ago in someone else's hand. Survival is not the same as freedom. I didn't erase it. I never had, because survival was where we all started. But freedom? That was something else. It wasn't just about walking away. It was about walking forward, and it was messy, imperfect. Still, it was real. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of a room I'd never entered before, a courthouse conference room in Olympia, the state capital. I'd been invited by a legislative advisory board to speak about the financial vulnerabilities of women in long-term partnerships. The irony wasn't lost on me. I looked out at a panel of attorneys, lawmakers, social workers, mostly men. Some skeptical, some curious, a few already distracted. I began the same way I always did. We're not talking about budgeting skills, we're talking about erosion. The room shifted, ever so slightly. Financial abuse doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It asks you to just trust, just sign, just let him take care of it, until one day you're staring at a life you helped build, and you own none of it. A pause, a breath. Then I told them about Nora, about Lily, about the women who had walked in with receipts, bills, contracts they couldn't read, about the ones who never made it to class because they were still trying to justify being kept in the dark. By the time I finished, 2 of the male panelists had stopped taking notes. They were just listening. Afterward, one of the women, Assistant Representative Dana Carver, approached me. "Would you be open to consulting on a proposed bill?" she asked. "We're drafting protections for financial literacy in divorce and domestic abuse proceedings." I nodded slowly. Absolutely. And just like that, a ripple began. Back in Seattle, the center continued to grow. We added 2 new classes, Money and Motherhood, and Red Flags in Romance Scams. The latter was packed within a week. Turns out, even tech-savvy women still fall for digital charm laced with deception. One night, a woman named Grace shared that she'd lost $24,000 to a man she never met in person. "I knew better," she said, eyes red. "But I wanted to believe someone could love me just for being me." We didn't interrupt. We let her finish. And when she did, Samantha said gently, "Believing in love isn't the mistake. Believing it has to come with silence is." The whole room nodded, and Grace came back the next week. That's when I knew this wasn't just a class anymore. It was a movement in slow motion. One that didn't need protests or podiums, just truth, shared, spoken, repeated. Like a chant, like a prayer, like armor. 6 months after our final summer session, I stood in front of a camera for the first promotional shoot of the paperback edition of Hidden Truths. The photographer asked me to sit in a leather armchair. Behind me was a bookshelf filled with law books and literary classics. "Do you want to hold the book?" he asked. I shook my head. "I think I'll just fold my hands. Let them see the woman, not the weapon." He smiled. "Got it." The photo went viral, not because it was flashy, but because it was still. Stillness, it turned out, had become my power. Then, in early December, I received a call from the Department of Justice. Damien had taken a plea deal, 6 years in a minimum security facility, 4 years of probation, full restitution of assets to shareholders, and partial damages to the charitable organizations he misused. He would be required to attend financial rehabilitation courses. The irony was exquisite. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time, not because I felt victorious, but because I finally felt nothing at all. The year turned. Winter gave way to early spring. Buds appeared along the trees outside my classroom window. Students returned with new notebooks and old fears. Some things never change, except I had. One morning, as I lectured on Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, I found myself pausing. Woolf had written, "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction." I looked at my students, mostly women, many first-generation scholars, some already balancing work and school and family, and I said something I hadn't planned. "But we're not just here to write fiction. We're here to write lives." They stared back, wide-eyed. "Not someone else's version of you. Not a script you're handed. Your own." And one by one, they began to write. By May, I was invited to keynote a national summit on women and economic autonomy. I stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., in front of 400 strangers. But it didn't feel strange at all, because I knew exactly who I was talking to. Women who had been told to be grateful, to be quiet, to be small. I told them the truth, that silence isn't safety, that dignity isn't granted, it's reclaimed, that the most radical act a woman can take is to name what she knows and refuse to give it back. When I walked off stage, I felt lighter. Not because I was done speaking, but because I'd finally said everything I needed to say. Back in Seattle, on the 1-year anniversary of Damien's arrest, I returned to the center. Just me, no class that day, just a chair, the chalkboard, and the mirror. I took it from my bag, the same one I'd given to every graduate of our program. The one that said, "Authority." I looked at myself and smiled, not because I had won, but because I had learned to live without needing to. Spring returned to Seattle without apology. It came with its usual contradictions. Cherry blossoms blooming beside construction sites, sunshine swallowed by sudden downpours, and the bittersweet scent of something ending and something else daring to begin. I had always found solace in transitions. Maybe because I had spent so long trapped in a life that never allowed for them. Now I was learning to let things change without needing to control every step of the process. That included myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't teaching a full load. I had stepped back from my Tuesday-Thursday lectures at Westbrook, passing the podium to a younger professor who reminded me of myself, only less cautious and far more willing to question the syllabus. Instead, I spent my mornings at home. A small 2-bedroom craftsman cottage nestled at the edge of Green Lake. White shutters, wide porch, nothing extraordinary, but every corner had been chosen. Every detail reflected a piece of me. The bedroom walls were painted slate blue. The kitchen had a chipped mug from my grandmother's house. My writing desk faced east so I could begin each day bathed in light, even when the weather tried to argue otherwise. There was no Damien in this house. Not in the furniture, not in the memories, not in the air, only me. And it felt, finally, like enough. On the first Wednesday of April, I received an invitation. It came via email, simply titled, "Invitation to participate in the National Women's Economic Alliance Roundtable." I read it 3 times. They weren't asking me to speak. They were asking me to join as a founding advisory member for a new long-term policy council. The goal? Develop a 10-year roadmap to expand access to financial education and legal protections for women across the country. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. There had been a time, just 3 years ago, when I was being gaslighted for daring to ask about a missing line in our joint investment summary. Now I was being asked to shape federal policy. I called Elena Carter that afternoon. We hadn't spoken in weeks, but her voice still made me feel like I had a spine made of steel. "You're gonna do it, right?" she asked. "I think so. I guess I wasn't expecting to be this visible," Elena chuckled. "Celeste, you've been visible for a while. You're just finally standing still long enough to notice it." The roundtable met in D.C. in mid-May, 14 women. All leaders in their fields, law, banking, education, tech. I was easily the most unconventional. I didn't come from corporate. I didn't wear blazers worth more than my car. I wasn't backed by an institution. I was backed by a notebook full of lived experience. When it was my turn to introduce myself, I kept it short. I'm not here as an expert. I'm here as evidence of what happens when silence is finally broken. There was a pause in the room. Then one of the oldest women at the table, a retired federal judge named Marlene, nodded. "Sometimes evidence is more powerful than law," she said. "You're exactly where you should be." Back in Seattle, the community group was now running itself. Samantha had taken over Thursday sessions completely. Lily was managing our outreach emails. Rachel had launched a grant writing committee and secured our first official funding. It was surreal. I still remembered our first gathering. Mismatched chairs, burnt tea, and women speaking in half-whispers. Now we had quarterly reports, a waiting list, a satellite chapter starting in Spokane. I wasn't needed every week anymore. And that realization, while it stung in the way all growth stings, felt like peace. I started going on long walks. I rejoined the neighborhood book club. I even tried painting, though my sunflowers looked more like yellow ghosts. I wasn't building an empire. I was learning how to just be. And in that stillness, something else opened. It began with a letter, not from Damien, from his sister, Meredith. I hadn't heard from her since the trial. She had distanced herself from everything, and I hadn't blamed her. Our history was complicated, but the envelope sat on my porch, handwritten, no return address. I almost threw it away. Instead, I opened it. It was short. 3 paragraphs. No defense, no explanation, just a quiet offering. "I was wrong not to reach out to you sooner. What Damien did to you, to others, it was devastating. And I didn't know how to face you without shame. But I've been thinking about your workshops, about what it means to teach women to understand what they've been taught to ignore, and I want to help, if you'll let me. I read it twice, then I cried. Not because I needed her validation, but because somewhere another woman had stopped pretending her silence was protection. It was progress. Quiet, personal, imperfect, but real. On the anniversary of my book's release, we hosted an open event at the center. The theme was simple: stories that changed us. Each woman brought a page, a journal entry, a contract clause, a line from a court transcript, something that once hurt, something that now healed. They pinned them to a board, and I stood in the back, watching. A mosaic of truths, redacted names, highlighted phrases, coffee stains, handwritten notes in shaky ink. Samantha stood beside me. "You think we'll ever run out of women who need this?" she asked. I looked around, at the filled chairs, the crowded hallway, the line outside the door. "No," I said, "but that's not the point." She nodded. "The point is that we never stop being ready for them." I squeezed her hand. Exactly. Spring had returned to Seattle without apology. It arrived with its usual contradictions. Cherry blossoms blooming beside construction zones, sunlight swallowed by sudden showers, and the bittersweet scent of things ending and others daring to begin. I'd always found peace in transitions. Maybe because I spent so long trapped in a life where change was forbidden. Now I was learning how to let things shift without needing to control every step of the process. That included myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't teaching a full course load. I stepped away from my Tuesday-Thursday lectures at Westbrook, handing the podium to a younger professor who reminded me of myself. Only less cautious, more willing to question the syllabus. Instead, I spent my mornings at home. A modest 2-bedroom craftsman cottage at the edge of Green Lake. White shutters, a wide porch, nothing spectacular. But every corner reflected me. The bedroom walls were slate blue. The chipped coffee mug in the kitchen once belonged to my grandmother. My writing desk faced east, so I could start each morning in light, even when the sky argued otherwise. There was no trace of Damien in this house. Not in the furniture, not in the air, not in the memories. Only me. And that finally was enough. On the first Wednesday of April, an invitation arrived. It came via email with a subject line that read simply, "Invitation to participate in the National Women's Economic Alliance Roundtable." I read it 3 times. They weren't asking me to speak. They were asking me to join as a founding advisory member for a new federal policy council. The mission? To create a 10-year roadmap expanding financial education access and legal protections for women nationwide. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. 3 years ago, I was being gaslit over a missing entry in a shared investment report. Now, I was being asked to shape national policy. I called Elena Carter that afternoon. We hadn't spoken in weeks, but her voice still made me feel like I had steel running through my spine. "You're doing it, right?" she asked. "I think so. I just didn't expect to be this visible." Elena chuckled. "Celeste, you've been visible for a while. You're just finally standing still long enough to see it." The roundtable met in D.C. in mid-May. 14 women, all leaders in their fields: law, banking, education, tech. I was easily the most unconventional. No corporate backing, no polished resume, no institutional title, just a notebook full of lived experience. When it was my turn to introduce myself, I kept it simple. I'm not here as an expert. I'm here as evidence of what happens when silence is finally broken. There was a pause. Then an older woman across the table, a retired federal judge, nodded. "Sometimes evidence is more powerful than law," she said. "You're exactly where you belong." Back in Seattle, the center was thriving without me. Samantha was running Thursday sessions on her own. Lily managed our outreach inbox. Rachel formed a grant writing committee and secured our first official round of funding. It was surreal. I remembered the first meeting clearly: mismatched chairs, burnt tea, and women speaking in whispers. Now we had a waiting list, quarterly reports, and a new satellite chapter launching in Spokane. They didn't need me every week anymore. And though that realization stung, like all growth tends to, it also felt like freedom. I began taking long walks. I rejoined the neighborhood book club. I even tried painting, though my sunflowers looked more like yellow ghosts. I wasn't building an empire. I was learning how to just be. And in that stillness, something else opened up. It started with a letter, not from Damien, from his sister, Meredith. We hadn't spoken since the trial. She had distanced herself from everything, and I hadn't blamed her. Our history was complicated, but the envelope appeared on my porch, handwritten, no return address. I nearly threw it away. Instead, I opened it. Just 3 paragraphs, no excuses, no defenses, just a quiet offering. I was wrong not to reach out sooner. What Damien did to you and to others, it was devastating. And I didn't know how to face you without shame. But I've been thinking about your workshops, about what it means to teach women how to see what they were taught to ignore. I want to help if you'll let me. I read it twice, and then I cried. Not because I needed her validation, but because somewhere, another woman had stopped mistaking silence for protection. It was progress. Quiet, imperfect, but real. On the anniversary of Hidden Truths, we hosted a celebration at the center. The theme was simple: stories that changed us. Each woman brought a page of a journal, a contract, a transcript, a letter, something that had once hurt, something that now healed. They pinned them to the wall. I stood at the back, watching, a mosaic of truth. Redacted names, highlighted phrases, coffee stains, shaky handwriting. Samantha stood beside me. "Do you think we'll ever run out of women who need this?" she asked. I looked around. Every seat filled, a hallway packed, a line forming outside. "No," I said, "but that's not the point." She nodded. "The point is we're ready for them." I squeezed her hand. Exactly. June arrived with long, light, and soft winds. I spent many afternoons on the porch, reading letters from former students, women I'd advised, and strangers who only knew my name from a dog-eared book shared between friends. What they all had in common was this: they thought they were alone. But they weren't. They were pieces of a tapestry, connected by quiet courage and whispered decisions. Not every story had a trial. Not every abuser was a headline. Some harm was subtle, some redemption silent. But it all mattered. I started writing again, not a sequel. A second book, yes, but not to retell the pain. This one wasn't about breaking free. It was about what happens after. I called it After the Fire, Notes from a Quiet Life. It wasn't dramatic. It was tender, about learning joy in small things, fixing my own sink, taking myself to the movies, realizing that solitude wasn't a punishment, but a room of one's own. One reader had once called me the compass you find when all your maps fail. I didn't know if I lived up to that, but I tried. One night in July, Lily called. She'd graduated college and was interning at a nonprofit that supported immigrant women. She was preparing to apply for a full-time role. "I'm asking for market rate," she said. I found benchmarks. I wrote my rationale. I even practiced my tone. I smiled. "And you believe you deserve it?" "I do." That was all she needed. That was everything. Later that summer, we held a picnic, our new tradition. No presentations, no binders, just food, laughter, and stories. Ava, one of our newer members, shared her story. "I was a financial consultant," she said. "I taught others how to invest, but at home, I had to ask my partner for grocery money for 3 years." We stayed quiet. Then Rachel smiled gently. "We're very good at hiding our brilliance." Ava nodded, eyes glistening. "But here, I don't have to hide." I looked around the park, each face familiar, each voice steady. They weren't the same women who first walked through our doors, and neither was I. That night, while packing up with Samantha, she turned to me and asked, "Do you think you'll ever love someone again?" I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, "Maybe. But this time, they won't need to save me, and I won't need to prove anything." Samantha smiled. "That sounds like something I'm learning too." Early one fall morning, I woke to the sound of wind and birdsong. No alarms, no deadlines. I brewed coffee, opened the window, and sat at my desk to write, not to tell a story of survival or revenge, but one about soft power. The kind of power that grows in silence, in knowing, in choosing. I no longer needed a courtroom or an audience, just a page, just truth, just breath, and the quiet continuation of a life that finally belonged to me.